The weeks following the initial HOA meeting unfolded like a slow unraveling of the peace I once believed the neighborhood possessed. What began as irritation now evolved into something far more calculated, as though Mr. Harrington had marked my home as the blemish on his perfect landscape and appointed himself the enforcer of a personal crusade. The tulip was gone, relocated without resistance, yet removing it did nothing to ease the scrutiny. If anything, it emboldened him. It started with warnings, polite on the surface but laced with condescension. Each notice arrived in my mailbox in pristine envelopes, citing vague infractions that seemed invented on a whim. One claimed my trash bins were not aligned to community standards, though they stood exactly where they had for years. Another accused me of having excessive foliage near my walkway, despite nothing having changed. The violations accumulated faster than I could read them, and with each one, the threat of monetary penalties grew heavier. What once felt like annoyance transformed into a looming sense of entrapment. Neighbors began noticing the pattern as well. They whispered but rarely voiced support, wary of attracting the same obsessive attention. Some offered sympathetic glances as they passed my home, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to risk involvement. The atmosphere shifted, revealing fault lines beneath the neighborhood's polished exterior. I could sense the division forming, those who quietly agreed Harrington had gone too far and those who feared being swept into the conflict. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrington patrolled his property with renewed zeal. He paced the boundary line with a measuring tape, pausing occasionally to stare at my yard as though seeking new evidence of wrongdoing. His lawn, trimmed to military perfection, seemed like an extension of his rigid personality, a landscape devoid of spontaneity, maintained with mechanical precision. Every time I stepped outside, his eyes followed, silently assessing my movements. The air itself felt surveilled. Then, without warning, the warnings transformed into fines. Real fines. The HOA sent an invoice demanding payment for several alleged infractions totaling hundreds of dollars. The list included the tulip, even though it had been relocated weeks before, and various other trivialities that were either fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Staring at the paper, I felt a mix of disbelief and anger tightening in my chest. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was a targeted attack. A methodical attempt to wear me down until I either conformed or surrendered. I appealed the fines, submitting evidence, photographs, timestamps, anything I could gather, but the HOA's response was slow and dismissive. Bureaucratic phrases wrapped around empty assurances, giving the illusion of fairness while offering none. It became clear that Harrington's influence within the board extended far beyond mere complaints. His voice carried weight, and his obsession was being reinforced by an authority far larger than himself. In the midst of this, a subtle shift occurred within the neighborhood. People who once took pride in their perfect lawns began to realize how quickly they, too, could become targets. The fear spread quietly, creating an undercurrent of tension that rippled through daily routines. Homeowners walked on eggshells, adjusting blinds, trimming hedges, counting fence slats, hoping to avoid the scrutiny that had become my daily burden. Yet, despite the discomfort, no one dared stand up to Harrington openly. The breaking point came one afternoon when I returned home to find a bright orange notice posted directly on my front door. This one was different, urgent, bold, unmistakably threatening. It announced that I was now under heightened observation for repeated violations and that additional action, including potential legal involvement, could follow if non-compliance continued. The language was severe, far beyond anything justified by the situation. It was intimidation in its purest form. I removed the notice slowly, my hands steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Standing on my porch, I looked across the lawn to see Harrington watching from behind his immaculate hedge, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction on his face, no anger, just an unsettling mask of stern self-righteousness. It was as though he believed he was performing a civic duty, cleansing the neighborhood of imperfection, starting with me. That night, as I sorted through the stack of warnings and fines, a realization settled over me. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Compliance would only encourage further harassment. Appeasement was no longer an option. If I allowed Harrington's obsession to dictate my life, I would lose far more than a flower or a few dollars. I would lose peace, autonomy, and any sense of belonging in my own home. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I had lacked for weeks. The line had been crossed, and the battle I tried to avoid was now unavoidable. The war over a single flower was no longer symbolic. It had become something deeper, driven by ego, control, and relentless fixation. And if Harrington wanted a battle, then he was about to witness a level of resistance he never expected. The conflict had reached a point of no return, shifting from petty annoyance to a battle for control over peace, sanity, and the right to live without relentless scrutiny. With the accumulation of unjust fines and the threatening notices pinned to my door, the situation no longer resembled a simple neighborly disagreement. It had spiraled into a struggle fueled by obsession, pride, and the quiet but unmistakable thrill Harrington seemed to derive from asserting dominance. If he expected me to fold under pressure, he was mistaken. Instead, his aggression awakened a resolve in me that had been dormant, buried beneath weeks of tension. I began documenting everything. Every interaction, every notice, every subtle change in the neighborhood's atmosphere. I cataloged timestamped photos, videos, written observations, anything that could expose the truth behind the claims made against me. What had once felt like an overreaction quickly proved essential, as the HOA's accusations grew increasingly bold. One notice cited an unapproved architectural alteration, referring to a gutter repair I had completed months before, long before the tulip ever bloomed. Another claimed I had parked too close to my driveway's edge, despite following the same routine for years without issue. The pattern was unmistakable. The charges weren't random but orchestrated. The surveillance intensified as well. I noticed Harrington outside more often, pacing with purpose, pausing near my property line with feigned casualness while clearly observing every detail of my yard. His posture always rigid, his expression cool and analytical. He resembled a sentry stationed on guard rather than a neighbor tending his lawn. Even in the evenings, subtle signs of monitoring appeared. A faint glow from his windows suggested he left lights on facing my home long after darkness fell, and on some nights, I could sense eyes on me when I stepped outside to retrieve a package or take out the trash. The pressure, however, seemed to affect more than just me. Whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Tension clung to the quiet streets like mist. Conversations halted abruptly when Harrington walked by. Neighbors who once chatted freely appeared hesitant to linger outdoors, mowing quickly, trimming silently, and returning inside with a nervous pace. It became clear many feared their own minor imperfections might become the next target of his fixation. Though no one openly confronted him, his tightening grip over the HOA's enforcement left little room for normalcy. People preferred quiet compliance to stirring the hornet's nest he had created. But despite the anxiety around me, I refused to withdraw. Instead, I searched for vulnerabilities in the HOA's behavior, missteps, contradictions, procedural flaws. I dug through community bylaws, reviewed past meeting minutes, and compared my treatment with that of other residents. What I uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Violations issued against me lacked consistency, ignored guideline exceptions, and contradicted previous enforcement patterns. The board, likely influenced by Harrington's relentless complaints, had allowed their authority to morph into a tool for personal vendettas. It was a weaponization of rules, disguised as community maintenance. Armed with documentation and determination, I prepared a formal complaint challenging the HOA's conduct. It detailed every inconsistency, each fabricated violation, and the pattern of targeted harassment. I mailed copies to the board, the association's legal department, and even a local oversight committee responsible for community governance. It was the first real pushback Harrington had faced, a crack in the armor he had built around his imagined superiority. For the first time, I felt momentum shifting, not in my favor entirely, but no longer against me without resistance. But resistance came with consequences. The very next morning, I discovered my lawn had been flagged, literally. Dozens of small markers lined the perimeter, each one indicating supposed areas of concern, identified by the HOA. The notes attached were vague, citing soil inconsistencies, edging issues, and potential encroachments, none of which fell within standard guidelines. The flags symbolized more than accusations. They were a visual declaration of war, an attempt to shame and isolate me within my own neighborhood. Later that afternoon, I noticed Harrington standing across the street with folded arms, surveying the flagged property with quiet satisfaction. His posture suggested triumph, as though he believed he had regained control. Instead, all he had accomplished was driving me further toward action. That evening, after the flags were removed and stored as additional evidence, I sat at my desk reviewing the latest notices. For the first time in weeks, I felt a shift, not fear, not submission, but a simmering resolve that steadied my thoughts. The conflict was no longer reactive, it was strategic. Harrington had built this feud on obsession, but I would dismantle it with precision and truth. The stage was changing. Lines were clearer. Motives were exposed. And while the neighborhood continued to suffocate under the weight of his scrutiny, I prepared for the next step, one that would strike at the foundation of the authority he relied upon so confidently. The escalation had begun, and the war that started with a single tulip was now moving into deeper, sharper territory. The days of quietly enduring the storm were over. The time had come to expose the roots of Harrington's obsession and reveal just how far he was willing to go to preserve his fragile sense of control. The flags on my lawn marked a turning point, not because they carried legitimate meaning, but because they revealed the lengths to which Harrington was willing to go. The escalation had passed beyond petty disputes and entered a realm of manipulation and imbalance, where rules served not as guidelines but as weapons. As I gathered the flagged markers into a box that evening, I sensed that the conflict had reached a stage where quiet documentation alone would no longer suffice. If change was to happen, it would require pressure, exposure, and a level of resilience that matched his obsession. In the days that followed, the neighborhood's tension deepened. People moved through their routines like actors performing under surveillance. Lawns were clipped with unnatural precision, outdoor activities were shortened, and even children played with a cautious distance from property lines. The community had become a stage set by fear, and Harrington guarded it with an unwavering vigilance. His presence lurked in subtle ways, blinds shifting as he watched the street, footsteps pacing along the edges of his yard, and the faint hum of his camera system pointing outward in every direction. But even as he tightened his grip, cracks began to form around him. My formal complaint had reached more than the HOA board. The Oversight Committee acknowledged receipt, requesting supplemental documents and any evidence supporting a pattern of misconduct. It was a small hint of hope, a sign that the system could be compelled to look inward. I spent hours assembling the timeline, structuring every detail with clarity, ensuring no accusation stood without proof. The stack of evidence grew thicker, forming a collective portrait of harassment that was impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding. Yet with every piece of truth I collected, Harrington seemed to sense the shift. His behavior grew erratic, though he attempted to mask it beneath the veneer of rigid composure. He increased his yard inspections, lingering near my property line with a meticulous intensity. He spoke with HOA members more frequently, gesturing toward my home with controlled but fervent emotion. It became obvious he was trying to maintain control of a narrative that was slowly slipping from his grasp. Meanwhile, a subtle but unmistakable change rippled through the neighborhood. A few residents began to question the sudden spike in violations issued across the community, many of them directed at individuals who had never faced issues before. Quiet conversations unfolded on sidewalks and in driveways, touched with frustration and a sense of injustice. Some approached me cautiously, sharing stories of minor infractions they received without warning, each claim echoing a growing dissatisfaction with the HOA's enforcement. Though no one openly confronted Harrington, the shift in sentiment weakened his influence in small but significant ways. The moment that truly signaled his unraveling arrived late one afternoon. While reviewing footage from the small outdoor camera I had installed weeks prior, not to watch him, but to protect myself from further tampering, I noticed something unusual. A shadowy figure moved along the edge of my yard well past midnight, pausing near the area where the flags had been placed. There was no mistaking the posture, even in dim light. It was Harrington, crouching low, examining the grass and adjusting something along the property line before quietly retreating into his yard. The footage provided undeniable proof of his obsession extending beyond daylight hours. It also raised questions that suggested the violations he reported may not have been discovered but manufactured. The realization sent a cold jolt through me. This was no longer about rules or aesthetics. This was a fixation spiraling into territory that threatened the very concept of privacy. Armed with this new evidence, I prepared a supplemental report for the Oversight Committee, attaching the time-stamped footage along with a detailed account of the suspicious activity. I knew the submission would increase pressure not only on the HOA board but on Harrington himself, forcing the narrative into an arena he could no longer control from behind his hedge or within the boardroom walls. The submission had an immediate, visible effect. Harrington's behavior shifted from confident surveillance to subtle paranoia. He inspected his own yard more frequently, checking corners and adjusting his cameras with increasing agitation. He paced along the street during odd hours, glancing toward homes as though searching for signs of betrayal. His once commanding presence seemed to shrink under the weight of uncertainty, though he attempted to maintain the facade of authority. It became evident that the system he relied on to enforce his will was beginning to turn against him. The HOA board, too, responded with unusual caution. Notices slowed. Follow-up letters were vague and non-committal, as though the board sensed an investigation forming and wished to distance themselves from its spotlight. The atmosphere around the community began to shift once more, this time with a growing sense that change was possible. As the pressure mounted, I realized the feud had entered a critical stage. The battle was no longer defined by fines or flowers but by exposure and reputation. Harrington's facade of order and control had begun to crumble, revealing the unstable foundation beneath. And while the outcome was still uncertain, one truth had become undeniable. The unraveling had begun, and the next move would determine whether the neighborhood remained under the shadow of his obsession or finally broke free from it. The subtle cracks in Harrington's authority soon widened into unmistakable fractures, shifting the balance of power in ways no one in the neighborhood could ignore. What began as whispered dissatisfaction now evolved into undeniable momentum. The Oversight Committee's interest, the growing awareness among residents, and the evidence I had submitted all worked together like a silent force pressing against the structure Harrington had carefully built. It wasn't a sudden collapse but a gradual unraveling, one that he seemed powerless to stop. Within days of submitting the footage, I received a formal acknowledgement from the committee stating that an investigation had officially been initiated. The message was concise yet heavy with implication. It confirmed that the concerns raised were valid and worthy of review, and that interviews, document audits, and procedural evaluations would follow. Though the language remained neutral, its meaning was clear. The authority Harrington wielded with such confidence was now under scrutiny. The neighborhood felt the shift almost immediately. Small signs appeared, subtle but unmistakable. The HOA began postponing meetings, citing internal administrative matters. The usual rigid enforcement of rules relaxed ever so slightly, as though the board feared that continuing their aggressive tactics would draw unwanted attention. Even the mailboxes, once brimming with warnings and reminders, now remained empty, a silence that spoke louder than any notice. Harrington, however, struggled against the turning tide. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, revealing the strain beneath his once impenetrable demeanor. He patrolled his lawn with an intensity bordering on desperation, inspecting edges with trembling hands, remeasuring boundaries as though hoping to reaffirm control through routine. His posture stiffened each time a car passed slowly, as though he feared it carried an investigator. Neighbors watched him from behind curtains, whispering about the sudden change in the man who once commanded fear with his rigid presence. Meanwhile, the oversight committee began gathering information quietly but thoroughly. Unmarked vehicles appeared near the HOA office. Board members were seen holding brief, tense conversations in parking lots. Documents circulated behind closed doors. The investigation became a shadow stretching across the community, prompting silence in some and careful observation in others. Tension mingled with hope, creating an atmosphere unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced before. Amid this growing uncertainty, a pivotal moment arrived during what was supposed to be a routine HOA inspection. Committee representatives, clipboard in hand, walked the neighborhood with neutral expressions, taking measurements and photographs. When they reached my home, they examined the lawn with clinical precision, noting the absence of any legitimate violations. They asked for access to the notices I had received, and I provided them without hesitation. Their instruction was clear: document everything and provide nothing to the HOA without copying them. Later that week, a quiet knock came at my door. A representative introduced herself, offering a subtle but reassuring glance. She explained that the evidence compiled, my documentation, the footage, the pattern of fabricated violations, painted a deeply concerning picture. She mentioned policies, standards, and misconduct, terms that hinted at ramifications beyond simple reprimands. Though she spoke carefully, I sensed the magnitude of her words. What had begun as a dispute over a single flower had grown into a case that could redefine the HOA's leadership. While this unfolded, Harrington's composure slipped further. Neighbors reported seeing him pacing outside late into the night, muttering as he carried stacks of papers back and forth from his house. He made abrupt appearances at board members' driveways, pressing them with whispered pleas that were swiftly dismissed. His lawn, once the pinnacle of precision, began to show subtle signs of neglect. Edges losing their perfect straightness, grass growing unevenly, weeds appearing uncharacteristically near his hedges. It was as though his obsession had consumed him so fully that the very image he fought to protect was now crumbling under the weight of his desperation. The neighborhood, once divided by fear, slowly began to reclaim a sense of unity. People talked more openly, no longer whispering or glancing over their shoulders. Conversations grew bold, sharing experiences of unexplained violations and questionable HOA decisions. Each story added another layer to the swelling case against Harrington's influence. For the first time in months, residents stepped out onto their porches with a sense of possibility rather than apprehension. Then came the turning point. One morning, official envelopes appeared at every doorstep. The HOA board announced an emergency community meeting to address ongoing concerns and developments regarding leadership conduct. The wording left no room for doubt. Harrington's reign as the unofficial enforcer of the neighborhood was nearing its end. As neighbors gathered that evening, the air thick with curiosity and anxious anticipation, a hush fell over the crowd. Board members entered with rigid expressions, papers in hand, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. The Oversight Committee attended as well, adding an undeniable authority to the proceedings. The meeting began with formalities, but soon shifted to the heart of the matter. Evidence was presented, patterns of harassment, procedural violations, discrepancies in enforcement, and the midnight footage of Harrington crossing into private property. Gasps filled the room, whispers surged, and faces turned toward him with a mixture of disbelief and dawning clarity. The facade he'd worked so hard to maintain shattered in a single instant. For the first time, the community saw him not as a guardian of order, but as a man consumed by fixation and fueled by the illusion of control. And as the meeting moved toward its inevitable conclusion, one truth became unmistakably clear. The breaking point had arrived, and the consequences would reshape everything that followed. The emergency meeting marked the moment the neighborhood finally saw the truth without distortion. The fallout began almost immediately, unfolding with a quiet force that seemed to ripple across every home, every yard, and every resident who had lived under the shadow of Harrington's rigid dominance. His influence, once unchallenged and intimidating, evaporated under the weight of evidence and collective realization. And as the room absorbed the magnitude of his actions, what followed became a turning point not only for him but for the entire community. When the board finished presenting the findings, an oppressive silence settled across the gathering. The residents, once obedient, intimidated, or indifferent, now stared at Harrington with expressions that ranged from shock to disappointment. He stood rigidly near the corner of the room, clutching a stack of disorganized papers, his posture unsteady as though the foundation beneath him had given way. The certainty he once carried had vanished, replaced by a hollow tension in his shoulders and a vacant fear in his eyes. The Oversight Committee spoke next, outlining the violations: abuse of authority, targeted harassment, tampering with private property, and fabrication of claims. Their tone remained neutral, professional, and deliberately detached, but each word stripped away another layer of his influence. By the time they concluded, the image of a man obsessively safeguarding the neighborhood's standards had collapsed into the reality of someone who had lost himself in a fixation no rulebook could justify. Harrington attempted a brief defense, piecing together explanations that faltered before they could gain momentum. His arguments lacked coherence, his confidence shaken beyond recovery. The board listened but offered little response. Their decision had already taken shape. Within minutes, they announced that Harrington would be removed from all HOA-related duties effective immediately, pending further administrative review. Moreover, the association would undergo external monitoring to ensure fair practices moving forward. A collective exhale swept through the room, relief, disbelief, and closure all merging into a single breath that seemed to lighten the air. Residents exchanged glances as the reality sank in. The force that had dictated their routines, enforced fear, and sparked countless violations had finally fallen. It wasn't a triumphant cheer that followed, but a quieter, deeper release, as though the neighborhood itself had loosened from the grip of a long, tense strain. As the meeting adjourned, people lingered longer than usual, drawn not by obligation but by the need to reconnect. Conversations blossomed, open, honest, and unguarded. Neighbors approached me with gratitude and shared stories of their own struggles, confessions of fines they never understood, and relief that someone had finally confronted what many had endured in silence. In that moment, the community felt more unified than it had in years, bound not by fear but by collective resilience. The days following the meeting brought visible transformation. The HOA notices slowed to a halt, replaced by revised guidelines that prioritized fairness and transparency. Inspectors became rare, operating under new oversight that prevented abuse of authority. The oppressive atmosphere gradually dissipated, replaced by the natural rhythms of neighborhood life: children playing freely, families gathering outdoors, and residents tending to their yards without dread of scrutiny. Harrington's home, once immaculate to the point of rigidity, began showing signs of neglect. His perfectly trimmed hedges lost their sharp lines, the grass grew uneven, and the once constant presence of his watchful figure vanished entirely. Curtains remained drawn, lights dim. Rumors circulated quietly that he had stepped back from community involvement entirely, that he considered selling his home, that the investigation had extended beyond the neighborhood. None of us knew for sure, and few felt compelled to pry. His obsession had consumed him, and now he faced the consequences alone. As the weeks passed, I found myself rediscovering a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The yard, once the center of conflict, became a place of quiet renewal. I planted new flowers, not to provoke, but to reclaim my space from the turmoil that had defined it. The tulip, symbolic in its simplicity, found its place in a corner of the garden, not as a challenge but as a reminder of how a single bloom had unraveled a greater truth. Over time, the community healed. The fear that once dictated behavior dissolved, and with it came a sense of freedom. Neighbors formed connections that had been stifled by the tension. Block gatherings returned. Laughter carried across yards again. The neighborhood gradually transformed from a rigid, rule-bound enclave into a place shaped by cooperation rather than control. And through it all, I understood that this feud, this strange, relentless spiral sparked by one flower, had exposed more than just Harrington's fixation. It revealed the fragility of power built on fear, the importance of standing firm against injustice, and the resilience that emerges when a community confronts its own silence. In the end, the war that once threatened to overshadow everything became the very thing that set the neighborhood free. Not through aggression, not through retaliation, but through persistence, truth, and the courage to challenge what others accepted in silence. What began with a single tulip ended with a transformed community, and a lesson none of us would forget.